I am going to be doing a video reflection of the course Critical and Cultural Perspectives. This video is going to have 3 parts. One part is going to be on the choice book From What Is to What If. The next part will be on the readings for diversity and social justice. And then the last piece will be on the overall reflection of the course material that we learned, as well as the 2 final projects. So first, let's begin with From What Is to What If, which was my choice book that I chose by Rob Hopkins. And this book was a little bit difficult for me to read the first time because the book contained a lot of questions. Now, as a person, I feel like I don't have much of an imagination. When I was growing up, I had a really hard time picturing things and being able to visualize. And this book is completely composed of not only data, but questions. It's very question heavy, which is getting you to think. So the book talks about imagination and how imagination is key. And I'm not going to review the whole book, but I am going to highlight some main findings that I found that caused a lot of reflection. So one of them is that there is a large rise on anxiety, and that imagination can actually decrease that anxiety and depression through the use of nature and play. And that was something I hadn't really thought about before. There's a large section in there that talks about how school is stifling imagination. And it says that students have the ability for all this large imagination until about a certain age, and it's right when they start school. And with that, as an educator, I began to reflect on how my classroom is run. And so this looks like a lot of conformity. It looks like my students sitting at desks and us learning in our classroom. And while I have tried to make some educational moves that would increase engagement and imagination, I could be doing more. So there's one time a year that I do a project-based learning opportunity where my students get to choose something they're interested in and really research that topic. But I have learned through this book that there are other ways that I could be doing that. I could be taking them outside and getting in nature to help reduce that depression and anxiety and start to increase their imagination and focus. And I could also be adding different ways for them to move in the classroom that would do the same thing, encouraging those questions. So this book is really pulling at you to start noticing opportunities for imagination, as well as giving you the data to back it up that this use of imagination can change patterns of behavior. It can influence your life and start working on broadening the hippocampus, which it talks about that shrinking. It also talks about imagination of communities getting together. And I grew up in Philadelphia, and I got a lucky opportunity to experience some of that. So this book kind of made me think about that when it was talking about how people get out of their houses and they play with other children playing with children, and how older people were usually the ones stifling that. And how if we were to imagine a way to make this accessible, then play would open the opportunity for a community to come together and enable children to understand the world. So that was a huge part of this book, and I agreed with it. It had an opportunity where the children were put on hours, which I thought was interesting. He was imagining, well, he spoke of a story where they were imagining putting hours that children would play outside, and the older people actually agreed to it. And so they talked about the findings in this book. But with that, it also talks about how imagination is how children understand the world. And so I was reflecting on my own experiences, and even with my own child, there are times where she's asked me to do something, or she has a huge imagination, and I have kind of downplayed it a little bit and said that we're not going to do that right now. We're not thinking about that right now. We need to focus. And so by reading this book, I've actually started to encourage those opportunities for her and started thinking about how we could include imagination more. And one of the last pieces that it talks about, I have two more things. So one of the last pieces is that it talks about tech, and it says our use of tech is causing our attention span to decrease. So the more we use our technology, the less attention span we actually have. And that is also not helping the imagination for anyone. And so I have reflected on that and our use in our house, and we use a ton of technology. We have the TV, we have computers, we have iPads for her to go on. And my child actually splits time in her other house is completely technology. That's all they do. And so with that, I realized that that's not really healthy for her. It's not giving her the opportunity to explore the things she needs to explore. So we have decreased our time in our house, about cutting it in half so that half of it is what we call playtime, and it is a non-tech time. This book really has opened my eyes to what imagination can do for children as well as adults. It's helpful for all. It talks about how picturing something like starting a community local market would help increase profits for the local community, and how boredom is your brain pushing for your imagination to start. I know that there have been plenty of times that I have felt absolutely bored. I had 2 yesterday that I can think of. And I know that before, if I had felt bored, I would have just sat there and said, okay, I'm going to go turn on something. And yesterday I was actually wishing for a project to do that I could start improving things around our house. And that was one of the first times that I've actually had an imagination. In fact, I'm looking for a house right now, and I started thinking about what the house would look like or what I could do to it. And I know that before this, and I had said earlier in this video, that I had, when I was younger, thought I had no imagination. I had a hard time picturing things. And as an adult, if you had asked me before I read this book, I would have said that I had nothing. I didn't imagine things. I don't ask questions. I go with the facts. I am very fact driven. And since I've read this book, it's opened my mind a little bit more to those possibilities. And I'm actually starting to see that I can picture things as well. So if you have an opportunity to read From What Is to What If by Rob Hopkins, I truly suggest it. While it is a lot of questions, and that might be hard the first time to get through, it starts to change your mind in small ways each time you read it. So maybe the first time there's a lot of questions and it's hard, but the second time you start really picturing what he's talking about and start thinking about the possibilities in your own life. So I really recommend this book. It's really helpful. It's really given me an opportunity to see what I could be improving in my life, and to kind of branch those imagination roots out for my child. So our second part is talking about readings for diversity and social justice. This was the book that we read all semester. Well, we were going to read all semester, and I read this book actually all March, and I tried to read a lot of parts of it. I found this book to be really eye-opening. Again, just like the choice book, I found that I was able to pick out things that I was doing that I didn't even realize. So the readings were really helpful. So the book's all about oppression, and it goes through a lot of them between racism and ableism and religion and everything. So without reviewing, I just wanted to tell you my reflections on the book. So this really had me look at it, and I noticed that one of the big ones that I was doing that I could think of while I was reading was ageism. So there was a article that talked about all about things that you say, and I noticed that I do some of them to my child. I don't always do it to the elderly, but it is something I do with younger students. I do it with my child and my children, or my students. So I'll tell them, oh, they wouldn't understand, or they're just too young. And while that sentence is widely used, this book demonstrates that that is ageism. I'm not giving them the opportunity to show me whether they understand or not. And reflecting on that, I really noticed that I had bias in some areas that I had to acknowledge to move past and be able to make my life more open to all without oppressing anybody else. I also reflected and noticed that our actions are really impactful. So I may say that to my child and she immediately shuts down. And with that, I need to do a few things, which the back of the book lists next steps. So I need to acknowledge the bias I have, as does everybody. We need to listen to the people around us when they're trying to tell us things. We need to take responsibility for our own actions, our own bias, our own oppression, or that we are displaying for others. And we need to stand up and speak for others. So it has a really good quote in the back of the book that I would just like to read really quick. It is by Alan G. Johnson. And it says that every oppressive system feeds on silence. And so with reflecting on this, I realized that I have a great opportunity with having a classroom that I can stop oppression where it starts. And while I might not be able to fully stop it, I might be able to give them an opportunity to see a different side, a different point of view, and hopefully have my students work on that. So I was able to look through that book and really see where I stood in my own bias, as well as what I could be doing in my own classroom to kind of help eliminate some of that oppression. And then for the overall part 3, overall arching values. So throughout this course, we looked at the 3 values of capitalism, humanism, and democracy. With that, if you had asked me before if I thought things ran on values, I would have said yes. I was 100% sure everyone has values that they can do, but I wouldn't have chalked it up to these 3. So we took all these smaller values and put them under these large arches, which is why I call them the overarching. And through this course, I was able to start realizing that everything has these 3 built-in values, and sometimes it's just one is bigger than another. And I did this by looking at my own project. So we were asked to do an advocacy project, and I did one for the coronavirus where I read books. Through that, I realized that not only was I pushing some oppression and bias onto my students, but that I was really using some different overarching values where I was marketing for Scholastic for that capitalistic value without even realizing it. And I did it a few times. And then when I was making these, it was due to my care for my students. I wanted them to be able to still experience an educational outlet that they can go to, or skills that they could work on. And then through democracy, through their right, I always thought that my students have a right to an education. And also I let them vote. So I was asking them for their opinion on those books. So I didn't even realize that I was doing these 3 values. And after doing some self-reflection onto the project, I was able to see that those 3 values not only were present, but were really pushing what I was doing. So the course has helped me realize where I am pushing oppression, what I could do to help move forward with imagination and with making a more inclusive, less oppressive environment for my students and my children, and how I can help with the social justice aspect within my own classroom and my own children, bringing those things up, using every opportunity as a learning experience and an experience for imagination. So where does this leave me for the future? Well, for the future, I am now more open to the ideas of my bias. I can look for the values that I am pushing, and I can be aware of how to make a more inclusive environment and less oppressive, like I've already said. As an educator, this is going to help me introduce more imagination into my classroom, and it's going to make students feel more safe. So that is my reflection on critical and cultural perspectives.